Hello, this is Eldoric The Guardian Tank, here with a quick tutorial video on some basic tanking theory. This time we're going to be talking about active mitigation. And active mitigation is a huge part of tanking in the Mist of Pandaria, so it's worth going over and make sure you get it. And all tanks have to really deal with this, and it is a departure, so it's worth understanding. Now for your viewing pleasure, I have Eldoric, my main. Here I have all the tanks, but I'll be using him just because I want to. And what we're going to be talking about here is active mitigation. Now, I've already said that, like 5 or 6 times just into the intro of the video. What we used to have in the past was passive mitigation. Now, I'm using mitigation meaning reducing damage, either through avoidance or actual mitigation, so don't get wrapped up on the terminology. But in passive mitigation, you would get lots of armor, you would get lots of avoidance, you would get your block high if you were a block tank and mastery. You would go into the fight, you would stay in front of the boss, you would do your threat rotation, and your ability to survive was pretty much based more or less on what you did before the fight. There wasn't a whole lot you could do during the fight to really increase your ability to live through it. Now, you had cooldowns, but those were kind of built in either I'm about to die and I need to hit something, or they need to be used at these specific times in the fight. It's not something you could regularly use. I mean, once a minute, every 2 minutes is really all you have on your cooldown, so it wasn't too involving. Now, what you have with active mitigation is the exact opposite. Now, you still have passive, you get your armor, you get all that good stuff, you go into the fight, but there's things you could do during the fight that will increase your life. So, what is active mitigation? It's through attacking, you build resources that you can then spend on defensive abilities. Sounds simple because it is simple. Now, when you actually use it in game, not quite as simple. It takes a little bit of getting used to, especially if you were a warrior tank and you were very used to sitting in front of them and just taking the damage and, hitting a bunch of buttons that didn't really matter because threat didn't really matter. So why are we doing this active mitigation model? Well, it's important to understand that what we used to have in the past, particularly in vanilla and in the Burning Crusade, was a emphasis on threat. It used to be that the tank really had to focus threat, and threat management was kind of king when it came to tanking. You had to be very good at spreading your threat out, making sure your healers didn't get aggro because you had very limited AoE moves that could get threat for you. You had to watch the DPS. DPS had to be very concerned about where your threat was, and threat meters were an absolute must in that game. There was a few problems with that. One, it wasn't too fun. Now, some people thought it was real fun, but here was the fun problem with it. DPS don't like to be artificially limited in the amount of damage they can do by how much threat the tank can do. Now, if you have a new tank in there and you have a really well-geared DPS, he's really only going to be hitting a couple of buttons during the fight because he can't go all out on the boss because he'll overdo your threat and he'll pull the boss. So they had to limit what the DPS can do, and what they want to do is do damage. And then it was very frustrating for new tanks. It made it very hard to get into tanking because you had this barrier. You couldn't just bring in a new tank and be like, oh, you're good to go. It wasn't that fun. And then you had another problem when you hit Wrath. That AoE became extremely popular, and everyone was using a lot of AoE moves, and threat was much easier to gain over a large quantity of foes, and very easy to maintain on the boss if you single fired on them, so it began not to matter that much. There was another issue that came about where at the beginning of the expansion they could balance threat and DPS threat, so the tank and the DPS should be roughly on par with each other and should be manageable. But by the end of the expansion, tanks want survival stats, DPS want damage stats, a gulf would be created, and you would be kind of back at square one where one couldn't really keep up with the other, and that wasn't fun for either group. You had things like Vengeance try to fix this, where it took part of your health, which is survival, and convert that into damage. I always thought that was a little bit clunky. But that's why threat kind of died out, and it's a good thing in a lot of ways. You should be able to maintain a bit of a threat. It should be there as almost a background mechanic to consider. You have to make sure your healers aren't getting hit, but you don't limit the ability of other players. So in comes active mitigation to give the tank something else to do, because if they're not worrying about threat, then why are they pushing threat buttons? After you got threat, you can just sit there and not do anything because all your ability to survive was more or less done before the fight began. not including cooldowns, but we've already talked about that. So let's look at it like this. With Active Mitigation, I care about how I hit, because I gotta hit them in order to get resources. In the case of the Druid, I have to get the mangles in, I have to get my last ray hits in because they give me more mangles, and I need to crit, because crit gives me rage. If I mangle, I get rage. If I crit, I get rage. So I want those stats to give me rage in order to use them on my defensive abilities. I have 2 primarily here. They keep changing, so I'm not even going to talk about, but you more or less get 2. One deals with kind of, for the Druid, totally avoiding damage right now, physical damage, and the other one has to do with healing. So you almost got a physical damage component and then a overall damage component, aka magic and physical. It's like that for the Warrior and the Druid. So I care about those damage stats again. It used to be that I cared because of threat. Now I care because I need to connect with my attacks in order to get resources, to get healing, to get mitigation from that. So during the fight, I'm actually doing something when I'm hitting buttons. I care about focusing on my resources. I used to not care. Only the Death Knight really cared most of the time. So it's a good change. And it's one that I find very encouraging for the gameplay. And I think there's going to be a lot of growing issues, a lot of growing pains. Because, again, if you had a tank that you only had to stand there, and now you really have to care about it, it's going to be a learning curve. But the good side of it is, if you are a good tank and you know when to hit it, like, you could pull your rage in order to maximize your ability in a short period of time to get maximum mitigation out, and a period of time when you need that, you're going to shine through as a good tank. Or if you can really pay attention and make sure you're hitting that, healer's going to notice a good tank from a bad tank. So it gives tanks an ability through actual gameplay to distinguish themselves. Most in the past, all you could do is be really good at kiting or really be on the ball when you had a tank swap. So it feels good to actually be like, hey, this is how I distinguish myself as a good tank, and that is through the active mitigation model, which I really think is going to be enjoyable. So let's take a quick minute and review. Active mitigation. The basics is you attack. Through your attacks, you gain a resource. Then you can use those resources on various defensive abilities, which increase your overall survivability. And this is something you have to do actively throughout the fight. That's it in a nutshell. Alright, well, I hope you enjoyed this quick tutorial video, and if you have any questions, please send them to theguardiantank@gmail.com, and also check out the Guardian Tank podcast, available on iTunes and gearing up for the expansion release. I think you're really going to like it. Anyway, until next time, this is Eldoric The Guardian Tank, and keep on surviving.